Hey guys, what's up? My name's Andy and you're watching Andy's Book Club. So last week we began covering the subtle art and we covered chapters 1 to 3. I'll leave that video down in the description if you need a review. So this week we're moving right on ahead and covering chapters 4 to 6. So if you're ready, let's jump in. So chapter 4 begins with the story of Hiro Onoda. So during the end of World War II, Japan surrendered and Hiro Onoda was a soldier, a Japanese soldier based in the Philippines. So they dropped pamphlets telling him that the war was over, he should just give up and surrender. So Hiro didn't believe what any of those pamphlets said. He thought it was a hoax made by the Americans to trick him into surrendering. So he hid in the Filipino jungle for like decades. He would get some news about the war was over and he should surrender. He wouldn't believe it and he would just go back into hiding in the jungle. And he would continue to harass the locals and conduct guerrilla warfare against the Filipinos just because he thought that he was still at war with the Philippines. So eventually, an American guy reads about his story and goes to find him, right? So the American guy finally finds him. And at that point, it's been like 40 years or something like that since the end of the war. And at that point, he finally believes that, oh man, the war is over. And he's been in the jungle and he's been suffering for like decades for nothing, essentially, because he fought for nothing. He fought for a country that doesn't even exist anymore. So Imperial Japan ended when World War II ended. So the reason why the author Mark Manson brings this up is that he wanted to ask the question, is there value in suffering, right? Because with Hiro Onoda's story, he willingly chose to hide out in the jungle and essentially just camp out in like the dirt for decades. He chose to live that kind of life just because he felt like that gave him a purpose, right? So he was still fighting for Japan in his heart. And consequently, when the American guy finally found him and they brought him back to Japan, he landed in a country that he totally did not recognize, right? So Japan after World War II was completely transformed from what it was before. And he said that he didn't like the country at all. He didn't like this new country because what he fought for was gone. So it can be said that he derived more value out of his life when he was suffering compared to what his life was after he stopped suffering and came back to a Japan that he didn't recognize. So he saw more value living out in the jungle than living in modern Japan. So the next point that we want to talk about is the self-awareness. So Mark Manson says self-awareness is like an onion, right? Because everyone has different levels of self-awareness. You know that feeling when you're mad and you don't even know why you're mad? If someone was there to keep on asking you, what's wrong? You'd say one thing and then somebody would ask you, why does that bother you? And then you go into another explanation and then they would ask you again, why does that bother you? You would realize that it's like an onion, right? There's layers to it. So maybe that first thing that you said was bothering you isn't the root of the problem, right? Maybe that first thing is just a minor annoyance. So for example, maybe you kicked your toe on the table and it hurts and that bothers you, but maybe that came after a horrible day at work. Maybe you complain because it hurts when you kick the table, but that's not really the true source of your problems, right? The true source of the problem was maybe a coworker yelled at you or something like that, or your boss yelled at you, or maybe it goes even further, right? Maybe you think that your boss doesn't respect you enough, or your boss mistreats you. You're not getting the respect that you think you deserve. So it's like an onion, right? So if people keep on asking you questions, you'll keep on answering with more and more thoughtful reasons on why something is bothering you. But at first, if there's no one to, really ask you those questions, most people are not self-aware enough to really realize the source of the problem. What Mark Manson says is that it's helpful to have that self-awareness so that if you encounter something that bothers you, just keep on asking yourself questions, right? Don't wait for your partner or wait for a friend or wait for your family to ask you, oh, what's wrong? And really sit down with you and dissect the problem. Because, maybe some of you have family members that are nice like that, but most people don't have the time or energy to really care about your problem specifically that much, right? So it's helpful if you have self-awareness in order to solve this problem yourself and really drill down to what's bothering you. So the next point is a story of Dave Mustaine versus Pete Best. So Dave Mustaine got kicked out of the famous band Metallica. I'm sure you've heard of them. So after Dave Mustaine got kicked out, he joined another band called Megadeth. And Megadeth was also very popular. Although it wasn't as popular as Metallica, it still sold millions of songs worldwide. It still got critical acclaim everywhere, right? So Megadeth was very successful by all means. Maybe not as successful as Metallica, but it was still very successful. But the problem is that when somebody asks Dave Mustaine about his life, he says that his biggest failure is not being part of Metallica. And that really bothers him, even though his new band, Megadeth, is also very popular. So it's all a matter of perspective, right? Versus someone like Pete Best. So for those of you who don't know, Pete Best, he got kicked out of the Beatles. And we all know how popular the Beatles eventually became. When Pete Best first got kicked out of the Beatles, he was really down and sad, right? So he got into alcohol and he got into all these depressive episodes. And essentially, it wasn't a good time for him, right? But eventually, he got over that. And then once he got over that, he says that, his life is better now than it would have been if he had stayed in the Beatles. So it's all a matter of perspective, right? So with Dave Mustaine, he founded another band that was really famous after he got kicked out of Metallica. While Pete Best, after he got kicked out of the Beatles, he didn't really do music anymore, right? He didn't really have any more great hits, or he wasn't very successful as a musician after that by any stretch of the imagination, right? But the point is that Pete Best ended up being happier than Dave Mustaine, even though Dave Mustaine seems a bit more successful. So I think that's the point that Mark Manson wants to drill down, is that everything is a matter of perspective. So it's a perspective because it depends on how you deal with a situation, right? So getting kicked out of a really famous band, that's a really bad situation, but it's what you make of it. I mean, maybe some of you can get rejected by a job, or maybe some of you get rejected by a crush, or rejected by this dream school that you want to get into, right? So on the surface, it seems like the world is ending and it's really bad. But sometimes these things are just like a Dave Mustaine situation, right? It's all a matter of perspective. Maybe you got kicked out of your dream school, but you can go to another school, and who knows, maybe you'd be happier at that second school than you would have been if you had gotten into the first school that you applied for. Your crush rejects you. Maybe you didn't want to be with that person in the long term. Maybe in the long term, you would have been miserable with that person, right? Maybe after your crush rejects you, you meet another person that you're more compatible with. So it's all a matter of perspective. So chapter 5 begins with the topic of choosing. So I know we already covered this a little bit last week, but this chapter is all about choosing. So first of all, Mark Manson says that choosing something makes you more motivated to do that thing. So I think the point here is that if you find something that you want to do, you'll actually be more motivated to do them. And if you find yourself demotivated, well, maybe that's not the thing that you actually want to do, right? So for example, if you're going to university for math, but you hate math, maybe you shouldn't go to university for math because you're just making yourself miserable. Maybe you should actually go to study something that you actually like. So if you find yourself demotivated to do math, maybe that's because that's not what your heart really desires. So the next point is the story of William James. So the story of William James goes like this, right? So his life is a disaster, and he can't do anything right. But then he gives himself 1 year. And then in that 1 year, he says to himself, I'm going to take full responsibility for everything that happens to me, whatever bad thing that happens, right? So what ended up happening was that once he started taking responsibility for his actions, then his life became better. If you're scratching your head and wondering how does that work, well, Mark Manson has an explanation in the next point. So you guys all know the quote from Spider-Man, right? So with great power comes great responsibility. Well, Mark Manson flips it backwards, right? He says, with great responsibility comes great power. Now, what does he mean by responsibility, right? So when people say responsibility, they often interchange it with the definition of whose fault it is. So for example, if you're driving and you hit someone, people say that, oh, it's your responsibility to deal with this issue. People kind of think of that as, oh, it's your fault. If you really think about it, there's a difference between fault and responsibility. So it might not be your fault if you get into a car accident. Maybe the other person hit you, right? But because the other person hit you and you have a wrecked bumper, you still got to deal with it. So you got to take responsibility for having a broken car and having to fix that broken car. It might not have been your fault that the car is now broken, but you still got to go and fix it. So that's what Mark Manson means by responsibility. So his point is that you should take responsibility for what happens to you, not necessarily just say everything is your own fault, right? Because you can't control some things. Bad things happen in life, and there's always going to be obstacles to your goals. So sometimes in life, things just happen, right? And they're not necessarily your fault, but you got to deal with them. And when you decide to take responsibility for things that happen to you, you'll notice a quick change in how your life goes. Like William James, when he decided to take responsibility for what happened to him, things got better really fast. Now let's talk about chapter 6. Now chapter 6 goes back to that perspective issue that we were talking about, right? So some things can be different just because of your perspective of how different they are. So things can be different just from your own perspective. And if you take a different perspective, things might look better or they might look worse. So first of all, he says that growth is iterative. What does that mean? So a lot of people think that success is just you either go success or you go to failure, right? So a lot of people think that, either you start from here and then you go to success or you go to failure. But that's not how life works, right? Life is complicated. So if you start off here, you might hit one failure, right? And then you might hit another failure, and then you might hit another failure, and then you might go around this entire maze before you hit one single success, right? So that's what he means by growth is iterative. He means that you need to take this thing step by step. And he goes on to say that pure certainty is bad, right? So imagine if you knew for certain the exact date and time and nature of your own death, right? Would that information make you happy or would that make you sad? Chances are it would not make you happy, right? It would make you sad because you're gonna be anxious all the time, right? You're gonna be looking forward. Well, not necessarily looking forward, but you're going to be expecting that day to come and you're going to be really nervous as that day draws closer and closer, right? So if you knew for certain that you're going to die on that particular day, then you would have a bad time for all the time leading up to that day. So that's kind of what he means by certainty is bad. Let's say if you knew for sure that you're gonna have a crappy day at work tomorrow, then you'll be super demotivated to go to work, right? Because you wouldn't wanna go to work because you know for certain that it's gonna be bad. Pure certainty is not always good, right? The future is unknown and maybe some things are better left unknown. The next point he says that if something threatens your identity, you wouldn't wanna do it. So what Mark Manson is saying is that everybody has a comfort zone, right? So, and that comfort zone is your own identity. So for example, if you're an English student and then you say, oh, I'm an English student, so I'm not good at math and I'm not even gonna try math. And whenever a math problem arises, you say, oh, I'm not good at that. I'm not gonna do that because I'm not a math student. And then math makes you more nervous every time you're presented with a math problem. So if something threatens your identity, you don't want to do that thing. And what Mark Manson is saying is that, that could be bad, right? That means that you're not willing to try new things. Let's say you have a great opportunity to make a big presentation in front of your boss, but you hate public speaking, right? And it goes against your identity because you kind of think of yourself as a shy person and you don't want to speak in front of a lot of people. Well, then maybe you're passing up a great opportunity to show your boss how great you are. And then maybe that will hinder your chances at getting a promotion. By pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zone, that's when we can hope to grow. But sometimes people are resistant to that. So that's not a good thing. And that's one thing that we want to watch out for and we should fix. So how do we fix that? Well, I put the word kill in quotation marks because don't get the wrong idea. He doesn't say actually to kill yourself. That would be really bad and that's not recommended. So what he means by kill yourself is that you gotta erase your past identity. So whatever you think of yourself as, whether if you think of yourself as an English student who's not good at math, whether you think of yourself as a shy person who's not good at public speaking, you should kill that portion of yourself and replace it with someone who is good at math or someone who is good at public speaking, right? Because that's how you grow. So you gotta abandon those parts of you that's holding you back in order for you to establish a new identity, and that's how you move forward in life. So I think that about covers it for chapters 4 to 6 of The Subtle Art. So let me know if I missed anything. Please put it down in the description if you think I missed anything, or if you have a question at all, or just anything. I love to hear what you think. And as always, be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I'll leave the links down below in the description. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching. Next week, we'll cover chapters 7 to 9 inclusive. So stay tuned for that.